So we were just talking before we just came live about Zoom and people being tired of this, but you know what? I'm not. And I was saying that some of you that are watching this right now may be actually watching it on our YouTube channel. And I was telling Liz that we actually get a lot of views after an event on our YouTube channel. So sometimes people might not be able to join us right here at 4 o'clock when we do them. We kind of picked this time frame to kind of help with the different coasts and getting authors, instead of them having to do something at 10 o'clock at night. That, you know, for you right now, Liz, I'm assuming
I'm in DC.
You're in DC.
So yeah, I'm in EST. Thank you. At 10 o'clock, I would not have much of a personality, really. I would just be this much of crankiness.
Exactly. That's what I'm kind of thinking. So it's like we try to do it, you know. So you're in Boston. I mean, you're in DC, and Sarah's out here on the West Coast with us. I'm up in Warwick's, for those that are joining us might not know, is located in La Jolla, San Diego. Sign there says 1896. We celebrated our 125th anniversary last year, which Sarah was a part of and came and celebrated with us. I'm actually up in the Carlsbad area doing these from my home office, and Sarah's like just around the corner and over the hill in Rancho Santa Fe. So we've got San Diego covered. We've got the East Coast covered, and hopefully there's some people joining us in between. So welcome, Liz. Like we said, this has been so fun doing these Zoom events, and so happy to have you.
Thank you so much. It's such a thrill to talk to you. Thank you for having me.
I loved this. I was gushing over it. There you go. You've got the hardcover. I have the galley. I'm going to treasure this galley because that's me right on the front there. Just saying, with our friend Augustine Burra.
So I really feel like I'm meeting a celebrity at this point.
Yeah,
because
right.
I told you before we started recording that your name has been just like right here in front of my face when I only had the galley, and it was like, this is going to be out in the world. And it was Julie Slavinsky right on the top.
I'm feeling like a celebrity right now. It's so great. Can't wait for everybody to read this. It's such a great memoir. So with that, couple just little quick things for those of you that are joining us on Facebook. I will be putting the link for Liz's book into that. You can order it from us. If you're in the San Diego area, we would love for you to stop by the store and pick that up from us, but we do ship. So anywhere you live in the country, we can get that to you. And also in that comment section, like I said, Liz and Sarah are going to chat for about 35 minutes. When they're done with their conversation, I'm going to bring in the audience questions. So we love that part of the program. So please put those into the comment section there as well. So with that, I've given Facebook enough time to let people know that we're all here. So here we go. Liz, and I meant to ask this, I'm going to mess your name up. Is it Scheier?
It's Scheier, like the hobbits.
Scheier. I love that. Speaking of, that was like speaking of being in the pit, Zooming and all that stuff. They had a great one. If you ever get a chance to watch the one that they did when the shutdown happened, oh my God, they're really good. I digress. Liz Scheier is a former Penguin Random House editor who worked in publishing and content development for many years. She writes book reviews and feature articles for Publishers Weekly. She's now a product developer living in Washington, D.C. with her husband, 2 small children, and a very ill-behaved cat, which we love those ill-behaved cats. Never Simple is her first book. Joining her today is Sarah Z. Sleeper. Most of you who come into this know Sarah, but we're going to do it. Sarah is an ex-journalist with an MFA in creative writing. Her debut novel, God, I always mess this up. Gaijin? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Got it. I got it this time. It came out in 2020 from Running Wild Press. Her short story, A Few Innocuous Lines, won an award from Writer's Digest. Her nonfiction essay on Getting Vivian was published in the Shanghai Literary Review. Prior to that, she had a 25-year career as a business writer and technology reporter, and won 3 journalism awards and a fellowship at the National Press Foundation. With that, ladies, have a great conversation. See you in a little bit.
Thank you. Thanks, Julie. Liz, so nice to meet you.
So nice to meet you. I am in awe. What a career.
Oh, you too. Back at you, 100%. And you know, these little Zoom boxes, I don't know about you, but I've come to really love them because I get to hear authors who live in Washington, D.C. or somewhere else that I would not get the chance to hear. Are you having that same kind of experience with Zoom?
Absolutely. You know, it's we were talking a little bit before we came online about how it's a little bit of a challenge for debut authors because we can't go into all the bookstores. But the nice thing is that it is unlikely that I could have been in San Diego tonight otherwise. So
Right, and here you
it's
are.
kind of a blessing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like having you here. I feel like you are here with me, so I'm happy about that. I am going to just, I have a few questions for you. I have a list here, and you feel free to go off in any direction or tangent you want to based on something that sparks your interest to talk about. So first of all, I want to show everybody the book, Never Simple. It's a memoir, and it was written up in the New York Times this weekend. So anyone who wants to see that can see the New York Times review of that book, which was fantastic. And when I read it, you know, it's really, I'm going to tell you the truth. It was difficult for me at moments because it was so emotional. And I had to put it down a couple of times and come back because of the authenticity and emotional nature of this, of your story. So that was the fact that you were able to capture that and convey that is, you know, credit to you as a writer.
Thank you.
And the writing is very colorful and sensory. Anyone who's not familiar with New York, or even if they are familiar with New York, your depictions of the different blocks and the different landmarks is so familiar to people who know New York and so informational and interesting to people who don't. So you really just created the scene. I had to keep telling my husband, do you know this intersection? Do you know what happened on that street? And he would be like, yeah, because he lived there. So um, so on a more serious note though, you wrote, and it's a quote that they used in the Times as well, you can still love someone who has caused you a lot of harm. And that's a very poignant thing to write. People feel that. I know what you mean. Can you, with the context, you know, putting context to that statement, can you tell us just a summary of your book and what that emotional truth means in the context of your story?
Sure, absolutely. And as you noted, I am from New York, so I talk very fast. So if I'm going too quick, just give me some sort of gesture and I'll dial it back. So the book begins, excuse me, on an otherwise uneventful afternoon when I was 18, when my mother came into the room. And I was going to get, I think it was a learner's permit. And she stood there in the door in her like giant purple muumuu. She was severely agoraphobic, so she dressed, her ensemble was entirely muumuus and house dresses. So she appears and, you know, hand on the doorknob, very nervous, which was not her thing. And she said, so I have to tell you something. You want to get a learner's permit? And I said, yes. And she said, you're not going to be able to get one. And I said, okay, why? And she said, well, you'll need ID. You need a birth certificate. And I said, okay. And she said, but you don't have one. I said, okay, why? And she said, well, I was married when you were born, but not to your father. And so over the course of the next 20 minutes or so came tumbling down this story, these answers to some of the mysteries that had plagued me my entire life. Primary among them, the two sort of groundbreaking facts that number one, she had been married for most of my life to a man I'd never heard of. And that number two, the man she had told me was my dead father was a complete fiction. She had entirely made him up, fake name, fake story, fake physical description, just everything about him she had made up. And the rest of the book follows, among other things, my journey to find out who he actually was and if anyone living knew him and remembered anything about him. And so my mother suffered from mental illness and was both a wonderful and terrible liar, depending on how you define those words. And she did a lot of harm to me and to really everyone around her, but she also suffered terribly. She was a woman who could be incredibly charming. She's very funny. She was brilliant, but she prayed for death every night. And during the worst of her phases, she would call me sometimes 12 or 15 times a day, just shuttling back and forth between rage, screaming, and weeping, because those were her two poles. And so I think that experience of being so close, you know, it's just the two of us in this Manhattan apartment. And so especially when I was younger, it was this very codependent, very claustrophobic relationship, it was really clear to me that although she was so damaging, she didn't intend it, and she was really suffering. So that gave me I hope that gave me a lot of empathy towards someone who is sitting under the weight of that kind of illness.
Okay, and so at what age was it that she told you these things that you didn't know? Were you about 15?
I was 18.
18, okay. And so you did or did not know at that age that she had agoraphobia or other mental illness, or you were just not quite sure still at that point?
Well, by then I knew something was wrong. When I was a young child, I understood that other parents did not, other parents had control of their rage.
Right.
Other parents could manage being at a PTA meeting without screaming at someone. Other parents did not physically threaten other children in the playground, just for an example.
Right.
And I knew that it was strange that my father wasn't there. I knew plenty of kids whose parents were divorced, but they could chart them in a map. They knew their names, right? That it was strange that I didn't know where my father was. And then by the time I was 11 or 12, when she confined herself to her bedroom for sometimes months at a time, I started to understand that it wasn't just eccentricity, that something was wrong.
Wrong. Okay. Well, and when you're describing your mom, she is equal parts interesting and charming, as she is, a little bit frightening in the way, or maybe a lot frightening in the way that she's behaving. So how would you say, memoir is such a very interesting thing because of course it's your perspective and your experience. And sometimes you have to have distance, to be able to come back and sort of define stuff. So now you're a little bit older than you were back then. So when you were younger, what did you see as the conundrums with your mom? Like, what were your persistent questions when you were growing up? What were you kind of like, what were you asking that you just didn't have answers for?
I mean, about 1,000 things, but there were two that were really the main things. Number one was, again, who my father was. She had told me this story that they had married. She was wearing a borrowed pantsuit. Not long after he stopped at a red light, the driver behind him didn't. He was killed instantly. In a storm of grief, she burned all his stuff, burned all the photos. None of her friends had known him. His family was all dead, right? And at some something about this does not strike me as right. But I could not at that age, my imagination wasn't such that I could understand that he might be dead, but just in a different way. I thought that the lie must mean he was alive somewhere. And so, we would walk around Manhattan and I would kind of look at every blonde man in roughly the right age and think, oh, maybe it's you. Mm-hmm. So I think that was thing number one, that I wanted to know where he was. And thing number two was that I didn't know how she was paying for us to live. I knew that she had been a lawyer, that she had stopped working sometime before I was born, and then who knows, right? And I will say that to this day, I do not have a full understanding of how she raised me in, I think, the third most expensive city in the world on zero income.
Right. Wow. I mean, that's pretty amazing when you think about that. And I have to say, the way that you described her in terms of her behavior, it's not clear immediately at all when you're reading it that she is as, challenged as she was. You didn't make that, you showed her with the nuance that I'm sure she had as a human being, and in your perception of it. And so I'm wondering, when you become an adult and you have a lot of revelations over the years, and I don't want to ruin the plot. I mean, we don't call it a plot, it's your story, but you only reveal whatever you want to reveal about it. What sort of revelations was it sort of the extent of her mental illness? Was it something about your actual father? What things did you just sort of become very surprised about to learn when you were a little bit older?
So there were a lot of things about my father that surprised and shocked me later, but those were not things she told me. She had not known him very long and remembered very little. So that, really all she gave me was a name, his real name. And she had, for some reason, I still do not understand, his social security number and a pile of other sort of demographic details. But I think what really surprised me was the extent of her illness, because again, I had figured out as a young teenager that something was awry, but not what it was. And these were hard things to talk about to other people, because if you have a parent who has, say, cancer or a heart condition, these are frightening, stressful, terrible things. And there are other people you can talk to about them. There are books and support groups and whatever it is. But it is harder to say to people, my mother calls me in the middle of the night under the influence of tranquilizers and says XYZ thing, right? You don't say that and have like a sea of hands go up saying, me too, me too. It can be very isolating. So I didn't talk to many people about it because it sounded so bizarre. And so when I finally found out that when I was in my mid-20s, she actually completely slipped up and let slip the fact that she had this diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. And I could go look that up and see that other people had it and read what the symptoms were. And I was just filled with this flush of extraordinary relief that someone else knew, that this had a name, it had an explanation, it was in a book, someone had studied it. It wasn't just this bizarre circumstance happening in my house.
Right. Well, and you write eloquently about the topic of lying, and the fact that because your mom was sort of a good liar, I guess most of the time, or skilled at it, you sort of were never sure when to believe what she said or when she didn't. That's interesting in itself. But aside from that, I'm just curious, how did that affect your communication style, as you got older?
I mean, I have many faults as a person, as all of us do, but dishonesty is not among them. I have developed a distaste, a discomfort, an anxiety around lying that makes me, I think, respond worse to it than many people do.
So you've kind of learned, you've taken your experience of being uncomfortable with her not being totally truthful and said, I'm going to be totally truthful.
Yes, and to expect it from the people around me, because what I learned from that experience is that I can be fooled, right?
Okay.
That you can put one over on me, that you can live in my house and tell me you're not married and tell me that my father's name was X, and I will believe you. And so that has put me in a position of wanting to be very clear that the people who are talking to me are telling me things that are true.
Right, of course. And as a kid, it's sort of the internal or external or both expectation that your parents are honest with you. You don't think that, they might tell a white lie to save your feelings, over time, but most people don't think, oh gosh, is what she's saying accurate or not? So that's got to make you feel a lot of different ways about when someone's dishonest with you. It really probably is like a trigger.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Okay. I want to ask you, because you did such a good job of describing it in the book, life with your mom was, both good and bad. And can you describe something that was really good living with her, and also something that was really, difficult or hurtful for you, so people will have a better view into what your life was like growing up there in New York in your apartment?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, my mother was brilliant. She was born in 1939, so she was a generation older than my friends' parents for the most part. But she had gone to law school in the early 60s and had been a lawyer at a time when there were not many women practicing law. Mm-hmm. And she was a staunch feminist. She had testified for the ERA. She I think she had me sign a paper when I was maybe 10 that I would not get married before I was 25 or have kids before I was 30. I beat both of those by some number of years, late bloomer. But and so, now I read my kids the Winnie the Pooh books where all the characters are female. She annotated them. So Christopher Robin is the only male in that entire book. And she raised me to believe that women can do anything, which I, was not true for many of the women she knew. She was expected to be a wife and a mother, and that was it. And she did not think that that was acceptable for me.
Well, cheers to that on International Women's Day.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes, good point. But, on the other hand, she could be very challenging to live with because one of the main symptoms of borderline personality disorder is a crippling fear of abandonment. And so relationships tend to be pretty unstable because if the person who you are in a relationship with has a boundary of any kind, it is so destabilizing and frightening. And so I could see that in her, that if I, misbehaved in a kid kind of way, like I put a water glass somewhere it wasn't supposed to go, 9 times out of 10, it went unremarked. But the 10th time, it was like the tsunami of anger came, right? And like spittle would start flying. She'd be screaming hysterically, like all the neighbors heard. It was clear that there was like there was nobody home behind the eyes. So that could be very frightening when I was very small.
Of course. And I wrote this question because just happenstance, I was listening to the Hidden Brain podcast. Do you ever listen to that with Shankar?
Yeah.
It's a great podcast. And this particular one was about mother-daughter communication. And so it's hard. It tends to be hard, for mothers and daughters anyway, to communicate. But when you have a mother who's fighting mental illness, like magnified the difficulties of communication by 100, right? So how were you able to solve that communication difficulty as you got older in order to have a sort of productive, positive, as much as you could situation with her?
Well, that's a bit of an assumption that we had a productive, positive relationship.
I read the whole book.
Sometimes we did.
Yeah, I know. You had to, let's say you communicated, except for when you didn't, but yes.
Largely it was flattery, making her,
okay.
And I guess I think that word has a negative connotation that I don't really mean. That if I said things that were reassuring to her, if how important she was, how yes, she was my mother, she was my only mother, all of those things, it would comfort her. And so she could be then very loving, because she did love me more than anything else on earth, right? But she could show that in a less toxic way. There were times as I got older, as dementia came in and started warring with her illness, and as I had my own children who she could not be allowed access to because she could be quite violent, stepping back was the only way to manage it. I stopped taking her calls for the most part. Certainly we didn't see her because I didn't trust her around the kids. So it was sort of a mix of smoothing things over and then taking a step back.
It's like self-protection, family protection.
Yep.
Well, so that's something that you talk about is your feelings about motherhood, which I can only imagine are different than other people's because of your situation. And I'm going to just read this quote from your book. You wrote that your own motherhood felt no better and no worse. No more nurturing. You felt no more nurturing just because I have someone else to nurture. Same strengths, same weaknesses, same sense of humor, same personality flaws, same me with babies. So that struck me as so solid. It's like you're a person who knows who you are, and this is who you are. You would be compassionate whether or not you had babies, for example. And I had to say, I really related to that because I have an adopted daughter. And when I adopted her, people would say, you're so much more compassionate now. And I'm like, no, I'm the same as I was before. But I wondered how your feelings about motherhood and because of your mom changed, or can you identify how it's making you a unique, let's say, as a mother?
Yeah, it's I think that my approach to motherhood is very spectator based. I spend a lot of time at playgrounds sort of sidling up to parents who seem to be doing a good job and trying to hear what they're saying and possibly repeat it. But I would say that my response to my own motherhood is at its core about mistrust. I do not trust that I will be a good parent to my kids because I have seen how badly it can go wrong. Because the thing is, my mother tried really hard. She gave it her absolute best. She gave it her all. It's just that her all was really bad, right? So it is hard for me sometimes to see how that might not be true of me. And I have also struggled to see the whole concept of motherhood as inherently non-poisonous. And I realize that that sounds strange, probably, because we have a culture of venerating mothers, right? The most perfect love, the most perfect selflessness. But that's not what it means to me at all.
Right.
And so I find myself sort of walking this line between showing my children how much I love them, but not subsuming them.
Mhm.
And I will say that, pardon me, in even the week that since the book has come out, that is the most common response I have gotten from other people, from readers who grew up with borderline parents, is suddenly we do have the people in the back of the room waving their hands saying me too, right? Other people who just don't know how to strike that balance.
Okay, wow. So would that mean that you would hope for someone who reads the book to be able to sort of see a little bit of a guidepost for how you went about it?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I don't know that my method was so successful, especially dealing with my mother, but I hope that people will just see a story of it at all, because when I was pregnant with my first, I looked around for books that were about parenting after a difficult childhood. And there are tons of memoirs of difficult mother-child
Yeah,
relationship, right?
yeah,
That's
yeah.
covered for that. But then there aren't, I did not see a lot that then covered that next relationship. How do you not just pour that trauma on down to the next generation? And BPD is generational. It is, one woman, usually a woman, has a trauma. Her child then is traumatized by that child, who then passes it on to her own, right? And it just keeps on going down. And
Right,
so I was looking for stories of people who had managed not to do that and
right.
was not really able to find any. So I'm hoping that it will be comforting for people to be seen.
Certainly it is, because you're living a fine life with a nice family, and you found your way to a part of life where you're content. And what else can we ask for at a certain point? So I felt uplifted by it. As much as I said it was difficult to read, the difficulty was, the parts where your mom was being unkind, which can make me cry right now when I think about it, or the parts where you were struggling with how to handle her as she was, going further and further into being elderly and ill.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I felt nothing but compassion, for that, because that's got to be an incredibly difficult thing to go through. So I certainly think people will, find much to be uplifted about when they read it. So
Thank you. I hope so.
I want to ask you about surprises. And you don't have to talk about, I will tell people that there is a mystery in here about sort of figuring out or not who your father is. Do you? Don't you figure it out? So I don't want to ruin the story for people, but so part of your quest is to learn about that. So during the quest, during that, and also when you then got objects from your mom's apartment after she left it, what did you receive that you were just like, wow, I had no idea she had this?
Yeah. I mean, there had been surprises coming in the mail for years, because I think, like a lot of parents, my mother liked to send me news clippings. So
Yeah.
there were all of those. And then she started sort of shedding her belongings as she got older. So I would open packages. And on one notable occasion, it was a packet of my own baby teeth, which I just was not expecting. I opened the envelope and it was like click, 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 and I jumped and screamed. So there were smaller surprises like that. But so when I came home with the contents of her apartment after she left it, and everything was just thrown into boxes completely randomly. It was like a half bottle of ketchup and a book, right? Just random stuff.
Mhm.
And it was the paperwork that was surprising, because for years she had this sort of 60s avocado green file cabinet, locked, keys swallowed for all I knew, but certainly not findable. And I tried. But I figured in there were secrets. There was my father's address. There was answers to why she was the way that she was in many ways. And I never did manage to find them until after her death. And what was surprising was the proof of the things I hadn't known. She had many, many drafts of wills, none of them current, but what I learned from those was that she had this husband who she was married to when I was, through most of my life. They never divorced, and so she was technically married until I was 16 or 17. And what I learned was that she had never changed her name back. So, she raised me. Her name was Judith Scheier. That was how she presented herself. But on her paper, she was Judith Miller, which was a name I had never heard and didn't know, right? And that was surprising. And similarly, I found, in a pile of stuff I didn't understand, another will, a much older one. And I thought, what can this be? This is some random cousin or something. And it wasn't until I looked back in some of our records that I understood it was my grandmother's, who I had never met because she died in the 60s. She died very, very young. And then that was yet another one of those, I don't know my own grandmother's name kind of revelations that really struck me.
Wow. Yeah, because a lot of people take those things for granted, that they would just know who their grandparents were or who their father is. And so without giving anything too much away, as you were looking for your identity of your biological father, did you find any particular factual detail that was a surprise?
I think mostly it was just that he had died so young. He was 28 when he died. And, by the time some of these mysteries were solved or not solved, I was about the same age. And it was, I think all of us of perhaps a certain age remember the time that we realized someone younger than us has died or our own age has died. And that sort of breaks a standard compact we have with the universe that we are still the next generation down. Right. And when that pact is broken, it is very unnerving.
Yes, I can agree with that for sure. So it takes a lot of courage to write a memoir, and that's the reason I'm a fiction author. Seriously though, it really does. It's a courageous act to reveal your feelings and your events and your family secrets, or however much you want to. And did you feel frightened, or did you have sort of a catharsis from writing this?
I think I'm frightened now. Publishing moves pretty slowly. And so, I finished the first draft of the book just as the pandemic was hitting. And, I worked on it for X months, and then it sold, and then a year and a half passed. And in all that time, I was kind of like, tra-la-la, at some point someone will read this book, but that is far off. And then in the last couple of weeks before publication, suddenly people like Julie were reading it and had thoughts about it and comments about it. And that just blew my mind that it was actually out there. We had a book launch party this weekend in my backyard because it's still COVID times. Yeah. And my neighbor sidled up to me and said, "So how does it feel to know that you just took off your clothes and got naked in front of the world?" And I was like, "Oh, like that. That is how it feels." Yes.
Well, I'm going to ask you a little bit more about writing, but on the line, since you're on the idea of having the book launch, mine also launched during the pandemic, so that was the whole thing. But how has your daily life changed now that you have a book out in the world? And being in the New York Times, that's a big deal. What has changed for you?
Every time anybody says those words, my head still explodes a little bit. I genuinely cannot believe that happened. I think mostly it is the responses that have changed. I mean, people who know me knew some of the story, not all of it, but some of it. So there's, I think, a little less element of surprise there. But I've had just so many people reach out and say either me too, or tell me their own story and ask me what they should do. Like, I don't know is the problem. I know what I did, and I think sometimes I did the right thing and sometimes I did the wrong thing. And if you gave it back to me to do again, I'd do everything differently and it would still be sort of right and sort of wrong, right?
Okay.
But I don't know that I can advise anyone else on this. I just hope that those people are now feeling better about telling their own stories and looking for ways to emerge, not unscathed, but less scathed from these situations.
Well, and so I wondered, you know, if for you writing a memoir was as difficult as some writers. I mean, some writers don't find it difficult, but many more, I think, do find it difficult. Did you feel like it was difficult, or did you feel like sometimes people say, oh, it just kind of rolled out once I started going? Did you have one of those feelings, or was it challenging all the time to put this on paper?
It was mostly challenging to decide what to put in, because, you know, for every Wonka story, there's 3 more. So I was just trying to figure out what would be most useful to other people, because the thing about memoir is that at the very least, you know what the story is, right? I'm working on a novel now, and like the terrible thing about it is that you have to make the whole thing up, right?
Yeah.
It's so much work, you know. So that was the good part, was just figuring out what the parts of the story were that would be interesting to other people and not just me.
Yeah, okay. And did you have editorial guidance in that regard when you were working with your publisher?
I did. Even before I worked with the publisher, I worked with an independent editor before I pitched my agent, because I wanted to be in like as easy to say yes to form as possible.
Mhm.
And so we did that, and then my agent and I had an editorial phase, and then again with my wonderful editor at Holt.
Well, and people who aren't in the publishing world may not know that for writers, oftentimes hiring an outside editor after you've written your draft is not uncommon, because it helps us see what we might be obvious to someone else, but we're just like, that's our favorite sentence, you know, we can't take that out. So I understand why any writer would do that. So do you feel day-to-day life is different now because you're doing things like this, you're doing interviews, and you're like, I assume you're doing appearances now that the pandemic has subsided?
I mean, that part is very different. Talking to strangers about this is very different. Feeling the sort of stamp of approval of these, right? Like last week I was a schmuck with a keyboard. Now I'm a schmuck with a keyboard in a New York Times review, right? But also things are very much the same. Today is my 4-year-old's birthday. I have a 4 and a 5-year-old. I have a full-time job, right? I do that work. So the course of my day is very much like it used to. I'm sort of having a Jenna Maroney week, in that this is all I can talk about now.
Well, that's all you should be talking about. And I bet your people at work are looking at you a little differently all of a sudden.
Yeah, I didn't think they were going to find out. And then someone put it on LinkedIn, and now they've read it, and my husband's boss has read it, and it's going to be an exciting week.
Now nothing's a secret anymore. Well, so I wanted to tell you too how much I really think the cover is quite beautiful for anyone who hasn't seen it yet. This young girl sitting on stone steps, basically looking up into the sky. Did you have a hand in picking this or designing this?
I did not. The team at Holt is really wonderful and put together a couple of different concepts, and then the design there. I love it. That is not me. I was not that
Okay,
put
I was
together
wondering.
at all.
Yeah.
So, though it would have been much more rat's nesty if it were me.
But you feel like this captures something about the book to you?
I think so. I mean, it's a very New York look. It's
Right.
it's very, Manhattan brownstone in the background. And that little girl's expression is just so wonderful. It's so wistful,
Yeah,
and hopeful.
right.
I mean,
Looking up.
she could be 50 now for all I know. I don't know who the model is, but I think
Right,
it's wonderful.
right. Okay, so here's the question everybody always wants to know. There are 2 things I feel that people always want to know. They want to know what you're working on,
Mhm.
number 1, if you're willing to talk about it. And they always want to know what you're reading.
Oh, interesting. So I'm working on a novel, as I mentioned, that is probably not fully formed enough to say much
Okay,
about.
understood.
I am currently reading the second book in Tamsin Muir's, I probably just butchered her name, Loch Tomb series, because I was a science fiction editor for most of my career. And this is a series about lesbian necromancers in space, which is basically the best tagline that I can come up with.
That's awesome. Very, very
It's amazing.
cool.
It's amazing.
Very cool. Are you working in the fantasy genre yourself or science fiction?
No,
So,
that
I'm not asking you to tell more than you want to tell. So now that you're an author, published author of some renown already, do you feel more enabled and positive about writing more books? Because it's scary no matter what, right?
It is. And that is such a good question, Sarah. And I think it is actually less about the renown, which I'm still stunned by and grateful for. It is just the having finished now 2 books, right? Because the hardest thing about writing a book is, wow, this is about to sound anodyne. It's just the writing of the book, right? Just getting your butt in the chair and finishing it. And I never, I don't know if you're familiar with the Jewish Passover tradition, but we have the song Dayenu, right? And it translates to, it would have been enough. And we talk about each miracle. If only this had happened, it would have been enough. I feel like I never thought I would start a book. And then I never thought I would finish a book. And then I never thought I would get an agent. I never thought I would sell a book, right? It's just every time a new thing happens, it's just like the top of my head blowing off.
Wow, that's so fantastic. What a great feeling. Okay.
I'm back.
And I wanted to tell you that Scheier, the name Scheier, I have my husband's cousin is married to a Scheier.
There are very few of us in the world. We may be related.
She's a former.
This is where ancestry.com comes in, right?
Allison Levy Scheier.
Wow. I'll have to look her up.
I'll email you about that separately, but my husband is Jewish, and I really, for people who haven't read it yet, I really enjoyed reading about the Jewish traditional service in this book. It was just a beautiful thing to read. So thank you for writing that too.
Oh, definitely. Great conversation. Thanks, Sarah. It was really, really good combo.
So
Thank you.
nice.
Yeah, there were so many things as I'm sitting back here listening. It's just like I kept wanting to jump in and go, oh, yeah, that part. Oh, yeah, that part was so good. But it had to have helped you being an editor to what you think you needed to know to write this book, right? I mean, that had to have been a big help to you.
It was definitely very helpful in being prepared that somebody else was going to edit my book, for example, which is, I think, can be striking for a lot of people. And also just helpful to know what the process looks like, right? That you sell it, and then I sort of know there's a marketing team, and I remember that there's managing editors, right? I have a sense of the situation.
Right, because that's, I think, a lot of first-time writers, especially, obviously, it's first time is they don't know. But that editing process, how important that is. And it's important to make that work the best that it can be for people like me who are readers who see it, a year down the line,
Well, I think when people are little younger or don't have experience in editing and publishing as she does, they might take every edit more personally.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
like,
that's what it ends up
happening. That
happening.
Sentence.
I remember one author said he was self-published, and it's just like, he was like, I don't need an editor. Like, oh, I'm not sure I want
Everybody
to have an event
needs
for
an
your
editor.
It's like, yeah, you kind of do need one.
I mean, we said that word "kill your darlings," and it's a cliche, but it's also just true. I mean, you just have to. Some of your favorite things, they just don't resonate with other people.
And the one thing that, I mean, because we have a lot of comments coming in on Facebook, Liz, and I wonder, are you prepared for people sharing their personal stories with you too? I mean, that's the thing that I think when you write something like this is open, it's just like people are just the outpouring that you're going to get of people with similar stories. And that's what I'm reading on the comments. It's
that's wonderful.
Yeah. It's just, Anne is saying, she always wondered what her own mother's trauma was that caused her BPD. And this book is probably going to help her, and I think it will, Anne.
Good luck, Anne.
And Randy said this happened to you, but equally intrigued. So he stayed and watched and listened. And so hopefully you'll be reading the book as well. And then Grace, she didn't realize her dad was mentally ill until she married and left home. It's comforting to listen to you, and she looks forward to reading your book. So thank you for sharing. So
Thanks.
some really, really great comments
Wonderful.
coming in. I have to thank Henry Holt for allowing us to host you today. I don't know if there's anybody watching from Henry Holt, but we love you and we love your books, and this is a gem. And Sarah, you're so right. The New York Times, that has to just be just one of those crowning moments.
Yeah.
I think I have a newspaper article saved that like we actually got the plate from the newspaper, but
Oh,
when,
wow. You
so
mean the
but
actual printing press
yeah,
plate?
we actually got the
Oh,
plate.
wow.
So it might be
Amazing.
hard to get that from the New York Times, but you've got to frame that. You have to frame
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
because that's the thing. You think that these things, it's like, oh yeah, that's going to happen all the time, and like sometimes, yeah, hopefully it will, and I'm sure it will,
Mhm.
because I can't wait to read your fiction writing, because your nonfiction writing and your memoir,
Thank you.
your writing is just, I just adored this. I'm gushing too much, doing fangirl on you.
Oh no, keep I love but thank you, Julia.
Keep going.
Especially from someone like you. That means the world to me. Thank you.
Yeah, it's so I can't wait to read what you have coming next. So Sarah, thank you again for a great interview.
Thank you,
My
Sarah.
pleasure. I
Yep.
loved talking to Liz. It was perfect way to spend the day for me.
Excellent. And Liz, best of luck to you with everything.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Soar with the success. So good night,
Bye.
everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
See you later.